29, 2018. Across America, employees locked the glass doors of 735 stores for the final time. Inside, the cavernous aisles were stripped bare, the vibrant primary colors replaced by sterile warehouse lighting. On the front windows, a final message from a beloved giraffe: "I don't want to grow up." It was the death rattle of an empire that once owned childhood itself. At its absolute zenith in the 1990s, Toys R Us commanded 25% of the global toy market, operating over 1,400 massive superstores worldwide and generating $11 billion in annual revenue. It wasn't just a store. It was a magical kingdom of endless aisles, towering shelves, and Saturday morning pilgrimages. Yet, just 2 decades later, the magic evaporated. The towering shelves were dismantled for scrap. The bustling parking lots turned into desolate expanses of cracked asphalt. Tens of thousands of workers who had spent decades creating holiday miracles were sent home with nothing. How does an untouchable behemoth, a category killer that crushed every local toy shop in its path, suddenly suffocate? It wasn't because children stopped playing with physical toys, nor was it simply the convenience of modern online shopping. The true autopsy reveals a much darker narrative: a catastrophic alliance, brutal retail warfare, and a ruthless Wall Street buyout that buried a beloved institution alive under $5 billion of insurmountable debt. This is the story of how corporate leveraged buyouts canceled playtime and how America's ultimate toy box was dismantled from the inside out. The year was 1948. The global machinery of World War II had finally ground to a halt, replaced by the quiet, suburban hum of a newly prosperous America. Millions of soldiers had returned home, trading their military uniforms for civilian clothes, buying modest houses in rapidly expanding neighborhoods, and starting families at an unprecedented rate. This was the dawn of the American baby boom. In Washington, D.C., a 25-year-old veteran named Charles Lazarus was observing this demographic explosion with the keen, analytical eye of a cryptographer, the exact job he had held in the military. When he looked at the young families pushing prams down the street, he didn't just see a post-war recovery. He saw a market that was about to exponentially expand. Lazarus returned to his roots to find his fortune. His father had run a bicycle repair shop, teaching him the grueling basics of retail and customer service. But Lazarus knew bicycles were not the future. The future was babies. Taking over his father's storefront, he opened a modest business called Children's Supermart, often remembered by its later iteration, Bargaintown, focusing primarily on heavy baby furniture, cribs, strollers, and high chairs. It was a highly logical starting point. Every new parent needed a crib, but Lazarus quickly encountered a fundamental flaw in his business model. Baby furniture was a one-time purchase. A sturdy, well-built crib could easily be passed down from a first child to a second, and even to a third. The customer cycle was agonizingly slow. Families would come in, spend a significant amount of money, and then he might not see them again for years. But as months passed, mothers kept coming back to the store, asking a simple question that would ultimately change the trajectory of American retail. "Do you have any toys?" Lazarus listened. He brought in a small selection of tricycles. They sold out almost immediately. He added rattles, stuffed animals, and simple wooden blocks. Within a few short years, the dynamic inside his store had completely flipped. The small, cheap toys were vastly outselling the expensive, heavy wooden cribs. Lazarus realized a profound retail truth. Toys are a disposable, constantly evolving commodity. A toy breaks, a child gets bored, a new Christmas rolls around, a birthday approaches. While a crib was a practical necessity, a toy was a recurring emotional purchase. The repeat business was limitless. By 1957, Lazarus was ready to make a monumental pivot. He didn't just want to sell toys, he wanted to completely dismantle and rebuild how they were sold. In the 1950s, buying a toy was a formal, often frustrating experience. You went to a small, independent hobby shop or a downtown department store. The toys were kept securely behind glass counters or high up on shelves. A clerk had to fetch the item for you. Selections were severely limited, prices were high, and the toy department in most major stores often shrank to a single dusty aisle for 10 months of the year, only expanding when the holiday season arrived. Lazarus looked at the booming grocery industry for inspiration. Supermarkets were revolutionizing food shopping by introducing a radical concept: self-service. Long aisles, brightly lit shelves, and the invention of the shopping cart allowed customers to wander, browse, and buy impulsively without ever waiting for a clerk. Why, Lazarus wondered, couldn't this exact same logistical model work for teddy bears and action figures? He decided to build a toy store on the scale of a grocery supermarket. It was an incredibly risky move. The idea of dedicating tens of thousands of square feet purely to children's playthings year-round seemed absurd to traditional retailers. But Lazarus was convinced that if he offered massive variety and slashed prices by buying in massive bulk, the sheer volume of sales would more than make up for the razor-thin profit margins. He needed a new name for this new concept. His old store names were too long, too generic. He wanted something punchy, something that would fit perfectly in massive, illuminated letters on a roadside sign. He settled on a simple declarative statement: Toys R Us. To give the brand a playful, instantly recognizable identity, he made a deliberately ungrammatical choice. He flipped the R backward, mimicking the clumsy, innocent handwriting of a child just learning the alphabet. It was a brilliant psychological hook. It signaled instantly to kids that this massive warehouse was built exclusively for them, while assuring parents that the store understood the spirit of childhood. When the first Toys R Us opened its doors, it introduced a revolutionary layout. Gone were the glass counters. Instead, customers grabbed a metal shopping cart and pushed it down wide aisles lined with inventory stacked nearly to the ceiling. It was overwhelming, chaotic, and utterly mesmerizing. Children were no longer separated from the products. They could reach out and touch the brightly colored boxes. The physical store itself had become an attraction. This was the birth of a retail concept that Wall Street would later term the category killer. By focusing maniacally on one specific segment, offering unparalleled selection, and utilizing aggressive supermarket pricing, Charles Lazarus had built a machine designed to systematically devour the competition. The local mom-and-pop toy shops never stood a chance. The era of the toy supermarket had begun. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Charles Lazarus's retail experiment evolved from a successful regional concept into an unstoppable corporate leviathan. Toys R Us didn't just participate in the American toy market, it systematically swallowed it whole. To understand the sheer magnitude of the company's dominance during this era, one must look at the retail landscape it left in its wake. For decades, the local neighborhood toy shop had been a staple of American main streets. These were quaint, independent businesses, usually family-owned, offering a carefully curated, but ultimately limited, selection of dolls, trains, and board games. Toys R Us hit this fragile ecosystem like a meteor. The strategy was brutal in its simplicity and unparalleled in its execution. Financial analysts coined a new, slightly terrifying term for what Toys R Us was doing. They called it a category killer. The playbook was straightforward. Enter a new suburban market. Build a massive warehouse-style store, often exceeding 30,000 square feet. Stock it not with a few hundred items, but with an astonishing 18,000 distinct toys, games, and bicycles. Because Toys R Us bought in such astronomical volumes, they could force manufacturers to give them wholesale prices that no local shop could ever secure. Lazarus then passed those savings on to the consumer. They sold merchandise at razor-thin margins, sometimes even taking a loss on popular items just to get families through the doors. The independent mom-and-pop toy stores, unable to match the inventory or survive the pricing warfare, quietly suffocated. One by one, they closed their doors, leaving Toys R Us as the undisputed monopoly of play. But this corporate ruthlessness was completely invisible to the children of the 1980s and 1990s. To them, Toys R Us was not a predatory retailer. It was a wonderland. Entering a Toys R Us at the height of its power was a sensory overload deliberately engineered to maximize desire. The automatic doors slid open to reveal a sprawling, brightly lit cavern of primary colors. The aisles seemed to stretch onto the horizon, stacked precariously high with colorful cardboard boxes. There was an entire avenue dedicated solely to Barbie. There was a seemingly endless wall of board games. The bicycle section looked like a sprawling chrome parking lot. And then there was the video game aisle. In a move that defined the childhood of an entire generation, the actual video game cartridges were kept locked in a secure cage at the front of the store. To buy a Nintendo or Sega game, a child had to walk down the video game aisle, find the display flap for the desired title, and peel off a small printed paper slip. Taking that fragile paper slip to the fluorescent-lit cashier's cage to exchange it for a plastic game case was a unique, unforgettable retail ritual. Overseeing this entire empire was a remarkably effective corporate mascot, Geoffrey the giraffe. Originally a simple cartoon drawing named Dr. G. Raff in the 1950s, Geoffrey evolved into a ubiquitous cultural icon. He was featured in every television commercial, splashed across Sunday newspaper circulars, and materialized as an imposing, slightly stiff walk-around character at store grand openings. In 1982, the company cemented its psychological hold on the American public with a marketing campaign that would become legendary. An advertising executive named Linda Kaplan Thaler penned a simple acoustic jingle. "I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid. They got a million toys at Toys R Us that I can play with." It wasn't just a commercial, it became a generational anthem. It perfectly encapsulated the core promise of the brand, a rejection of the boring adult world in favor of an endless, commercialized wonderland. By the mid-1990s, the company's power was absolute. Toys R Us controlled an astonishing 25% of the entire global toy market. They generated over $11 billion in annual sales. Their influence over the toy industry was absolute and dictatorial. The buyers at Toys R Us were the ultimate kingmakers. If a manufacturer like Mattel, Hasbro, or Kenner wanted a new action figure or doll to succeed, it absolutely had to be on the shelves of Toys R Us. If the chain's buyers passed on a product, it was effectively a death sentence. Manufacturers routinely altered their packaging, adjusted their pricing, and even changed the designs of their toys just to appease the executives at Toys R Us. They were untouchable. They had crushed all traditional competition. They had conditioned millions of American families to view their massive parking lots as the only logical destination for a birthday or Christmas present. But in the unforgiving world of corporate retail, absolute power often breeds fatal arrogance. Sitting comfortably on their throne, the executives of Toys R Us believed their brick-and-mortar formula was eternal. They believed they had solved the puzzle of retail forever. They were so busy looking down at the competition they had already defeated, they failed to notice the entirely new kind of war that was quietly brewing on the horizon. As the 20th century drew to a close, a new and unpredictable frontier was rapidly opening: the World Wide Web. For the executives sitting in the Toys R Us boardroom in Wayne, New Jersey, the internet was viewed not as a fundamental paradigm shift, but merely as a shiny new catalog system. They were retail kings of asphalt and steel. They understood physical footprints, end caps, and distribution centers. E-commerce was a foreign language. Their initial attempt to speak that language ended in complete humiliation. During the holiday shopping season of 1999, the newly launched ToysRUs.com buckled under a massive surge of online traffic. The company's fulfillment infrastructure was entirely designed to ship massive pallets of toys to retail stores, not to mail individual action figures to residential addresses. As Christmas Day approached, the system catastrophically collapsed. Thousands of parents received "We're sorry" emails informing them that their children's presents would not arrive in time for the holidays. The public relations fallout was disastrous, culminating in a hefty fine from the Federal Trade Commission for misleading delivery promises. The leadership team panicked. They realized they did not have the technological expertise or the warehouse infrastructure to compete in the digital space. Instead of investing the time and capital required to build that capability from the ground up, they looked for a shortcut. They decided to outsource their entire digital future. In August 2000, Toys R Us entered into what would become one of the most infamously short-sighted corporate agreements in retail history. They signed a 10-year exclusive partnership with a rising online retailer based in Seattle, a company still primarily known for selling books and CDs. That company was Amazon.com. On paper, it looked like a brilliant synergy. Toys R Us would identify, purchase, and manage the toy inventory, leveraging their massive industry clout. Amazon would handle the website design, order fulfillment, customer service, and shipping. Under the terms of the agreement, Toys R Us paid Amazon $50 million a year, plus a percentage of their sales, to be the exclusive toy vendor on Amazon's platform. They even redirected the toysrus.com domain name straight to Amazon's website. The brick-and-mortar giant breathed a collective sigh of relief. The messy, complicated problem of the internet had been handed off to the tech geeks in Seattle. Toys R Us went back to focusing on their massive physical superstores. But this was a Faustian bargain. Toys R Us had just invited a Trojan horse into their empire. By outsourcing their e-commerce, Toys R Us willingly stopped learning. They stopped collecting their own customer data. They failed to build their own dedicated fulfillment centers. They ignored the rapidly evolving science of digital marketing and user experience. They essentially paid Amazon to learn the highly lucrative, deeply complex mechanics of the toy business using their inventory. The relationship began to fray almost immediately. As Amazon's ambitions grew, Jeff Bezos and his team realized that the third-party marketplace model was vastly more profitable than relying on a single mega vendor. Amazon began allowing other, smaller toy merchants to sell their products on the platform. Suddenly, Toys R Us found their exclusive storefront crowded with competitors. If a customer searched for a popular Lego set, Amazon's algorithm might direct them to a cheaper third-party seller instead of Toys R Us. The executives in New Jersey were outraged. They felt profoundly betrayed. In 2004, Toys R Us sued Amazon for breach of contract, demanding the termination of the agreement. After 2 years of bitter litigation, a judge finally ruled in favor of Toys R Us in 2006, allowing them to break the contract and awarding them millions in a later settlement. But it was a hollow, tragic victory. The financial compensation was entirely irrelevant compared to what they had actually lost: time. By 2006, the digital landscape had completely transformed. A full half-decade of e-commerce evolution had passed them by. While their competitors had spent those critical years building robust, independent online shopping ecosystems, Toys R Us was forced to start from scratch. They had to frantically rebuild their website, establish their own digital supply chains, and reintroduce themselves to online shoppers who had long since moved on. They had handed their greatest weapon to their future executioner, and by the time they realized their mistake, they were hopelessly, permanently behind. Yet, as devastating as the digital failure was, an even more immediate and brutal war was about to begin in the physical world. While the executive team in New Jersey was locked in a bitter legal struggle over their digital soul, an even more devastating conflict was unfolding in the physical world. For decades, Toys R Us had relied on a simple equation. They offered an inventory so vast that no local competitor could possibly match it. They were the undisputed category killer. But by the late 1990s, they found themselves facing a completely new breed of predator, one that didn't just want to kill a single retail category, but all of them. Enter the era of the mega discounters, Walmart and Target. These big box behemoths were aggressively expanding across the American landscape, building massive supercenters that aimed to be a one-stop shop for every conceivable household need. And as they expanded, they set their sights firmly on the incredibly lucrative multi-billion-dollar toy market. Walmart in particular did not play by the traditional rules of toy retailing. They deployed a ruthless, highly effective financial strategy known as the loss leader. The concept was brutal in its simplicity. During the critical holiday shopping season, a period that traditionally accounted for up to half of a toy retailer's annual revenue, Walmart would take the hottest, most highly anticipated toys and slash their prices down to wholesale cost or even slightly below it. If the must-have item of the year was a Tickle Me Elmo, a Furby, or the newest Nintendo console, Walmart was perfectly willing to lose $2 or $3 on every single unit they sold. To them, the toy itself was irrelevant. It was merely bait. They knew that if a stressed, exhausted mother came into their store to buy that heavily discounted toy, she would also buy her weekly groceries, a new set of bath towels, and perhaps some winter coats for her children. The massive profit margins on the clothing and home goods more than subsidized the financial loss taken on the toy. For Toys R Us, this pricing strategy was a mathematical nightmare. Because they were a category killer, they only sold toys, games, and baby products. They did not have an aisle of high-margin electronics or winter apparel to offset their losses. They could not afford to use their core product as a loss leader. Suddenly, the mighty toy empire found itself trapped in an unwinnable dilemma. If they matched Walmart's rock-bottom prices, they would instantly destroy their own profit margins and bleed cash. But if they refused to lower their prices, they appeared hopelessly expensive to the average consumer. Furthermore, the cultural definition of convenience was rapidly shifting. In the 1980s, driving to a dedicated Toys R Us for a birthday present was considered an exciting weekend excursion. By the early 2000s, dual-income families were increasingly starved for time. The idea of making a separate, dedicated trip to a crowded toy store became a chore. It was infinitely easier for a parent to simply toss a Barbie or a Lego set into their shopping cart while they were already at Target buying laundry detergent and milk. The emotional magic of the toy store was being systematically replaced by the sterile efficiency of the general supercenter. The tipping point arrived in 1998, delivering a psychological earthquake to the retail industry. For the first time in history, Walmart officially surpassed Toys R Us to become the #1 seller of toys in the United States. The crown had been stolen. The category killer had been mortally wounded by the generalist. The internal reaction at Toys R Us was one of panic and confusion. Instead of leaning into their only remaining advantage, creating a spectacular, immersive, and magical in-store experience that a clinical Walmart aisle could never replicate, corporate leadership began aggressively cutting costs to protect their shrinking bottom line. The consequences of these cuts were immediately visible on the sales floor. Staffing levels were slashed, meaning there were fewer employees available to help a parent find a specific toy or clean up a messy aisle. The towering shelves began to look less like a wonderland and more like a chaotic, unmanaged warehouse. The bright primary colors of the 1980s faded into dingy, scuffed linoleum floors and flickering fluorescent lights. The stores were aging, and the company lacked the free cash flow required to modernize them. By the early 2000s, Toys R Us was a wounded giant. They were losing the digital war to Amazon, and they were losing the physical price war to Walmart and Target. Their sales were stagnating, their stores were deteriorating, and their stock price was languishing. They were incredibly vulnerable. And in the ruthless ecosystem of American capitalism, vulnerability inevitably attracts sharks. As the company struggled to redefine its purpose in the new millennium, a group of powerful men in the boardrooms of Wall Street were quietly looking at the struggling toy retailer not as a brand to be saved, but as an asset to be stripped. By the spring of 2005, Toys R Us was a profoundly vulnerable institution. The crushing price war with Walmart had eroded their profit margins. The disastrous alliance with Amazon had stunted their digital evolution, and their sprawling, aging superstores were increasingly viewed by consumers as relics of a bygone retail era. The company's stock price languished, reflecting the deep skepticism of the public market. The board of directors was exhausted, out of ideas, and actively looking for an exit strategy. They initially considered breaking the company apart, perhaps selling off the highly profitable Babies R US division to save the core toy business. Instead, they caught the attention of Wall Street. During the mid-2000s, the American financial sector was in the midst of a private equity boom. Massive investment firms were actively hunting for legacy corporations that possessed two specific traits: strong, reliable cash flow and a vast portfolio of valuable real estate. Toys R Us, despite its modern struggles, still generated billions of dollars in annual revenue. More importantly, it owned hundreds of massive commercial properties situated in prime suburban locations across the globe. To the financial engineers of Wall Street, the company was not a struggling toy retailer. It was an underutilized asset waiting to be optimized. A consortium of three powerful investment groups stepped forward: Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, KKR, Bain Capital, and Vornado Realty Trust. KKR and Bain were titans of private equity, specializing in acquiring companies aggressively cutting costs, and eventually selling them for a massive profit. Vornado, significantly, was a real estate investment trust. Their inclusion in the partnership was a clear signal that the true value of Toys R Us lay just as much in the dirt beneath its stores as it did in the toys on its shelves. In March 2005, this consortium announced they were purchasing Toys R Us and taking the public company private. The headline purchase price was an astronomical $6.6 billion. To the general public, and even to many of the store-level employees, the acquisition sounded like a desperately needed rescue mission. The press releases spoke of unlocking value, strategic turnaround plans, and revitalizing the brand. It was easy to believe that these billionaire investors were arriving with deep pockets, ready to inject billions of dollars into renovating the dark, aging stores and building a world-class e-commerce platform to finally defeat Walmart and Amazon. But that is not how private equity works. The consortium was not injecting $6.6 billion of their own money into the company. They were executing a complex, aggressive financial maneuver known as a leveraged buyout, or LBO. In a leveraged buyout, the acquiring firms put up only a small fraction of the purchase price using their own capital, in this case roughly $1.3 billion. The vast majority of the $6.6 billion purchase price was borrowed from massive global banks. However, the private equity firms did not take on this massive debt themselves. Through the mechanics of the buyout, the debt was secured against the assets of Toys R Us and placed directly onto the toy company's own balance sheet. It was the corporate equivalent of taking out a massive mortgage to buy a house, but legally forcing the house itself to make all the monthly payments. Toys R Us was essentially forced to borrow the money that was used to purchase it. The moment the ink dried on the 2005 acquisition contract, the fundamental DNA of Toys R Us was irreversibly altered. It ceased to be a retail company dedicated to selling toys to children. Overnight, it was transformed into a financial vehicle designed strictly to service debt. The numbers were staggering and ultimately fatal. When the buyout was finalized, Toys R Us was saddled with approximately $5.3 billion in long-term debt. This was an astronomical burden for a company that was already struggling to maintain its market share. The immediate consequence of this debt was the interest payments. Just to maintain the loans, without even paying down the principal balance, Toys R Us had to pay roughly $400 million in interest every single year. To understand the catastrophic impact of this $400 million annual anchor, one must look at retail as an ecosystem that requires constant nourishment. In the fiercely competitive landscape of the 2000s and 2010s, survival required massive, continuous capital investment. Target and Walmart were spending billions redesigning their store layouts, improving their lighting, and training their staff. Amazon was investing tens of billions in server farms, predictive algorithms, and a nationwide network of high-speed fulfillment centers. Toys R Us needed to make those exact same investments. Their stores were desperately in need of modernization. Their website required a total overhaul. Their employees needed better wages to improve morale and customer service. But the money simply did not exist. Every dollar of profit that the stores generated, every ounce of revenue squeezed from a holiday shopping season, was immediately vacuumed up and sent to Wall Street to satisfy the relentless $400 million annual interest payment. The executives placed in charge by the private equity firms were trapped in an impossible mathematical paradox. They were tasked with turning the company around, but they were entirely stripped of the capital required to actually execute a turnaround. The physical deterioration of the stores accelerated rapidly. Aisle carpets became stained and frayed and were never replaced. Broken display shelves were left unpatched. The once vibrant, magical atmosphere of the 1980s was replaced by the grim, clinical reality of deferred maintenance. The company was forced to cut staffing to the absolute bone, meaning the massive warehouses were often managed by a skeleton crew of exhausted minimum wage workers who could not possibly keep the inventory organized or assist frustrated parents. Behind the scenes, the real estate was also being aggressively monetized. Properties that the company had owned free and clear for decades were sold off and then leased back to the stores, generating quick cash for the parent companies but adding massive new monthly rent liabilities to the already suffocating balance sheet. For the next decade, Toys R Us would perform a miraculous, agonizing high-wire act. Year after year, they managed to generate just enough cash during the crucial Christmas season to pay the banks and survive another 12 months. They were not growing. They were not innovating. They were a corporate zombie bleeding $400 million a year, slowly being crushed to death under the invisible weight of a $5 billion anchor forged in a Wall Street boardroom. The fatal blow had been struck in 2005. It would just take 12 agonizing years for the company to finally stop breathing. As the calendar turned into the 2010s, the American retail landscape was undergoing a massive, expensive physical renaissance. Target was investing billions of dollars to remodel its stores, creating brightly lit, aesthetically pleasing environments with wide aisles and clear signage. Walmart was aggressively upgrading its supercenters to shed its bargain bin reputation. Independent specialty stores were creating highly curated, experiential shopping spaces. Toys R Us, however, was frozen in time. The catastrophic reality of the 2005 leveraged buyout was now entirely visible to the naked eye. When a corporation is forced to wire $400 million a year to Wall Street banks just to cover the interest on its debt, the first thing to be sacrificed is the capital expenditure budget, the crucial funds required to maintain, repair, and upgrade physical locations. Walking into a Toys R Us during this era was no longer a magical experience. It was an exercise in nostalgia tinged with profound melancholy. The once vibrant superstores, many of which had not seen a significant renovation since the late 1980s or early 1990s, were rapidly decaying. The iconic, multicolored geometric floor tiles were deeply scuffed, peeling, and often stained. The fluorescent lighting overhead flickered inconsistently, casting a harsh, clinical pallor over the merchandise. The massive, towering shelves that once seemed awe-inspiring to a child now just looked imposing, dusty, and unkempt. The physical deterioration extended to the exterior as well. In suburban strip malls across America, the familiar rainbow-colored logos were fading under the sun. Burned-out neon letters went unreplaced for months. Parking lots were riddled with potholes. The infrastructure of the empire was literally crumbling, but the corporate office in New Jersey simply did not have the cash reserves to fix it. This deferred maintenance created a devastating psychological shift in the consumer. A toy store relies heavily on emotion. Parents are willing to spend money because they want to participate in the joy and wonder of their children. But it is impossible to feel wonder in a building that feels like an abandoned warehouse. Shoppers began to actively notice the grime. They noticed the out-of-order restrooms. They noticed the erratic heating and air conditioning. The contrast with their competitors was lethal. If a mother had the choice to buy a Lego set in a pristine, well-lit Target aisle, or in a dimly lit, aging Toys R Us with torn carpets, the choice was obvious. The company was trapped in a fatal, inescapable feedback loop. The massive debt required severe cost-cutting. The cost-cutting destroyed the in-store experience. The terrible experience drove loyal customers away, and the resulting drop in revenue made the debt even harder to pay. They were starving to death, and the physical stores were showing the ribs. While the buildings themselves were falling apart, a much quieter, more tragic collapse was happening to the human beings who worked inside them. In its golden era, Toys R Us prided itself on customer service. The aisles were populated by workers who knew the inventory, who could help a confused grandparent find the exact action figure their grandson wanted, and who kept the chaotic, toy-filled environment organized and safe. But as the financial vice tightened in the 2010s, the private equity overlords demanded deeper and deeper cuts to the payroll. Store managers were handed impossible operational mandates. They were told to run massive 40,000 square foot retail warehouses with a fraction of the necessary workforce. This gave rise to the era of the skeleton crew. It became common for a sprawling Toys R Us location to have only 3 or 4 employees on duty at any given time. There would be one person strapped to a cash register, one manager confined to the back office handling paperwork, and perhaps one lone associate responsible for patrolling miles of aisles, unloading delivery trucks, stocking shelves, and assisting customers. The human toll was immense. Employees, the vast majority of whom were making near minimum wage, were pushed to the brink of physical and emotional exhaustion. They were tasked with an Sisyphean workload. Delivery trucks would arrive packed with highly anticipated holiday inventory. But because there was no one available to unpack the boxes, pallets of toys would sit untouched in the back stockrooms for days. Meanwhile, the shelves on the sales floor sat empty, leading customers to incorrectly assume the store was sold out. When parents couldn't find the toys they were looking for, they looked for help. But finding an employee in the cavernous, understaffed store became a frustrating game of hide and seek. When a shopper finally located a worker, the employee was often too rushed, too stressed, or too overwhelmed to provide meaningful assistance. The interaction, once the cornerstone of the brand's magic, devolved into mutual frustration. The corporate culture shifted from one of childhood wonder to one of bleak survival. The employees who stayed, some of whom had worked for the company for decades and genuinely loved the brand, watched helplessly as the institution they helped build was systematically hollowed out. They saw executives in the corporate headquarters receiving millions of dollars in retention bonuses, while they were denied basic equipment, sufficient hours, or livable wages. The joyful chaos of a Saturday morning toy run had been replaced by a grim, transactional slog. The aisles were messy because there was no one to clean them. The shelves were unorganized because there was no one to zone them. The magic of Toys R Us hadn't just faded. It had been actively, mathematically budgeted out of existence. By 2017, the company was a hollow shell, balancing precariously on a knife's edge. They were bleeding cash, bleeding talent, and bleeding consumer goodwill. All it would take was one minor disruption, one unexpected shock to the system, to bring the entire crumbling structure down. That shock was about to arrive, right before the most important season of the year. To understand how a retail empire abruptly dies, one must look closely at the invisible arteries of commerce that keep it alive. For Toys R Us, the lifeblood of the business was not just the physical toys, but the fragile, complex system of credit and trust shared with the manufacturers who made them. In the late summer of 2017, that trust evaporated, triggering a fatal cardiac arrest just weeks before the most critical season of the year. The crisis began quietly in the sterile, heavily guarded towers of the financial insurance industry. Retailers like Toys R Us do not typically pay upfront for the millions of action figures, board games, and bicycles they stock for the holidays. They rely on trade credit, essentially taking delivery of the inventory in September and October, selling it to consumers in November and December, and paying the manufacturers, like Hasbro, Mattel, and Lego, in January. To protect themselves from the risk of a retailer defaulting, toy manufacturers purchase insurance on these shipments from specialized financial firms. But in August 2017, the analysts at these insurance firms looked at the Toys R Us balance sheet and panicked. They saw a company suffocating under $5 billion of debt from its 2005 leveraged buyout. They saw a massive wall of debt maturity approaching in 2018, meaning hundreds of millions of dollars in loans were about to come due, and the company had no clear way to refinance them. Deeming the retailer too risky, the insurers drastically cut or entirely canceled their coverage on Toys R Us shipments. The reaction from the toy manufacturers was instantaneous and ruthless. Without insurance to guarantee their payments, the major toy companies refused to ship their products on credit. They demanded cash up front, or at the very least, cash on delivery. For the executives at Toys R Us headquarters, this was a doomsday scenario. They were already severely cash-strapped, hoarding every available dollar just to make their agonizingly high-interest payments to Wall Street. They simply did not have the hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid cash required to buy their holiday inventory outright. Suddenly, the supply chain froze. Delivery trucks that were supposed to be rolling toward Toys R Us distribution centers, packed with the season's hottest items, were halted. Warehouses sat half empty at the precise moment they needed to be filled to the brim. Faced with the terrifying prospect of going into the holiday shopping season with bare shelves, the board of directors made a desperate, agonizing decision. On September 18, 2017, Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in a federal court in Richmond, Virginia. It is crucial to understand that Chapter 11 is not designed to be a death sentence. It is meant to be a hospital for sick companies. The goal is restructuring, not liquidation. By filing for Chapter 11, Toys R Us was granted an immediate legal shield from its creditors. More importantly, it secured a massive $3 billion debtor-in-possession DIP financing package, a specialized loan designed specifically to keep bankrupt companies operating. The public relations team immediately launched a massive damage control campaign. They blanketed the internet and news media with reassuring messages. They emphasized that all 1,600 stores worldwide were open for business. They promised that the bankruptcy was simply a strategic financial maneuver to restructure the crushing debt inherited from the private equity buyout, and that the company would emerge stronger, nimbler, and ready to reclaim its crown. The $3 billion DIP loan was essentially a lifeline meant to unlock the frozen supply chain. With court-approved cash in hand, Toys R Us could finally pay the manufacturers. The trucks started rolling again. The inventory began to arrive. But the corporate executives had drastically miscalculated the psychological impact of the word bankruptcy on the American consumer. To the financial wizards on Wall Street, Chapter 11 is a standard, often highly lucrative legal tool. To an exhausted mother in suburban Ohio trying to buy Christmas presents for her children, bankruptcy means the store is closing, the products are defective, and the return policy is void. The company had survived the immediate financial crisis of September, but they had inadvertently poisoned their own well right before the harvest. The stage was set for the most disastrous holiday season in the history of American retail. As November 2017 arrived and the crucial Black Friday shopping weekend loomed, the atmosphere inside Toys R Us stores across the country was a toxic mixture of desperation and forced cheer. For the 33,000 employees working on the front lines, the Chapter 11 filing hung over their heads like a guillotine. They had been assured by corporate leadership that their jobs were safe and that the restructuring would save the company. Yet they were the ones who had to face the confusion of the public every single day. Shoppers walked into the stores expecting massive, immediate liquidation discounts, mistakenly believing that a bankruptcy filing meant everything was on sale. When customers realized that the prices were normal and often significantly higher than what they could find on Amazon, they left in frustration. The employees were tasked with executing a doomed strategy. They were pressured by management to aggressively push the Toys R Us credit card to families, a practically impossible task given the relentless news headlines predicting the company's imminent demise. They were told to maintain the magic of the toy store, but they were doing so in aging, understaffed buildings with peeling floors and flickering lights. Meanwhile, competitors smelled blood in the water. Walmart, Target, and Amazon recognized that Toys R Us was wounded and highly vulnerable. They launched a coordinated, ruthless assault to steal the category killer's remaining market share. Walmart and Target aggressively utilized their loss leader strategies, deeply discounting the exact toys that Toys R Us relied on for its core revenue. They offered aggressive price-matching guarantees, free shipping, and convenient curbside pickup. Amazon unleashed a relentless barrage of targeted digital advertising, ensuring that parents could buy every item on their child's wish list with a single click, never having to set foot in a crowded, deteriorating superstore. Because of the supply chain freeze in September, Toys R Us was also suffering from agonizing inventory imbalances. The $3 billion lifeline had arrived too late to secure enough of the absolute hottest, most sought-after toys of the season. Parents would venture into a Toys R Us specifically for a hard-to-find item, discover an empty space on the shelf where it should have been, and immediately pull out their smartphones to buy it from a competitor while still standing in the aisle. The physical reality of the stores during December 2017 was a tragic contradiction. The speakers still piped in cheerful holiday music. The aisles were still filled with brightly colored boxes. Geoffrey the giraffe still smiled down from the signage. But the kinetic energy, the chaotic joy that had defined the brand for decades, was entirely absent. The sprawling parking lots, which in the 1990s would have required a police detail to manage the traffic, were unnervingly empty. When the holiday season concluded and the calendar flipped to January 2018, the corporate accounting teams began tallying the final numbers. The results were catastrophic. Despite the $3 billion emergency loan, despite the desperate marketing campaigns, and despite the exhausting efforts of the frontline workers, Same-store sales had plummeted drastically compared to the previous year. The Chapter 11 restructuring plan relied entirely on a robust, profitable Christmas season to prove to creditors that the core retail business was still viable. The catastrophic drop in revenue proved the exact opposite. The emergency lenders who had provided the $3 billion DIP loan panicked. They looked at the dismal sales figures and realized that if they allowed Toys R Us to continue operating, the company would simply burn through the remaining cash and leave the lenders with nothing. In the cold, unfeeling calculus of Wall Street, the tipping point had been reached. The brand had crossed the fatal threshold. The creditors came to a unanimous, devastating conclusion. Toys R Us was now worth more dead than alive. Its inventory, its real estate leases, and its intellectual property were more valuable if they were liquidated and sold for scrap than if the stores were kept open. The grand, hopeful promises of emerging from bankruptcy stronger and leaner were quietly abandoned in corporate boardrooms. The restructuring plan was torn up. The hospital ward was being converted into an execution chamber. For the 33,000 employees who had just survived the grueling holiday season, the new year brought a brief, tense silence. They had stocked the shelves, they had worn the red shirts, and they had believed the corporate reassurances. They did not yet know that the math had already been finalized. The verdict had been reached, and the final days of their empire had already been scheduled. On March 15, 2018, the lingering uncertainty finally evaporated, replaced by a cold, inescapable reality. Toys R Us officially submitted court documents seeking approval to liquidate its remaining 735 United States stores under Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The rescue mission was aborted. The empire was shutting down. For the 33,000 retail employees, the announcement was a profound betrayal. For months, they had been assured by corporate leadership that their grueling efforts during the disastrous holiday season were part of a viable turnaround strategy. They had believed the restructuring plan. Now they were abruptly informed that not only were they all losing their jobs, but the company's severe insolvency meant there would be absolutely no severance pay. The sting of this sudden unemployment was radically amplified by the actions of the corporate boardroom. Just months prior to the final liquidation order, top executives had secured court approval to pay themselves millions of dollars in retention bonuses, financial incentives ostensibly required to keep skilled management engaged during the bankruptcy process. To the frontline workers earning near minimum wage, it was a sickening display of corporate looting. The architects of the company's demise walked away with millions, while the workers who actually swept the floors and stocked the shelves were left with nothing but an impending final paycheck. Within days, control of the physical stores was handed over to third-party liquidation firms, specialized companies whose sole purpose is to extract the maximum possible cash from a dying retail corpse. The liquidation sales were not a celebration of bargains. They were a chaotic, undignified scavenger hunt. When the store closing banners were draped over the iconic rainbow signs, throngs of consumers flooded the parking lots, expecting massive, immediate discounts. However, the liquidators operated on a calculated mathematical curve. They often raised the price of the remaining inventory back to the absolute highest manufacturer's suggested retail price before applying a modest 10% or 30% discount. Customers, realizing they were often paying more than they would at Walmart or Amazon, became notoriously hostile, directing their frustrations at the already devastated, soon-to-be unemployed cashiers. As the weeks dragged on into late spring, the physical degradation of the stores accelerated. The mandate was absolute. Everything must be sold. This did not just apply to the action figures and board games. Employees were instructed to put price tags on the physical infrastructure of the company itself. The towering steel gondola shelving units were dismantled and sold for scrap metal. The shopping carts were auctioned off. The display cases, the employee break room microwaves, the office chairs, and even the store safes were priced for clearance. The vast, colorful warehouses were being systematically stripped down to their concrete foundations, piece by piece, while the employees were forced to facilitate their own erasure. By the final week of June 2018, the transformation was complete. The once bustling wonderlands of childhood were unrecognizable. Entering a Toys R Us in its final days was a deeply unsettling, almost post-apocalyptic experience. The sprawling aisles, previously packed to the ceiling with vibrant packaging, were now entirely barren. A profound, hollow silence replaced the familiar hum of piped-in pop music and children's laughter. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating nothing but cracked linoleum floors, exposed electrical wires, and the skeletal remains of dismantled display racks. The stores had been hollowed out. For the remaining employees tasked with overseeing the final hours, the grief was palpable. Toys R Us was not just a typical retail job for many of these workers. Because the company had dominated the 1980s and 1990s, a significant portion of the staff had literally grown up as Toys R Us kids. They had walked those same aisles holding their parents' hands. Some had worked for the company for 20 or 30 years, building careers, meeting spouses, and forming deep community bonds within those windowless walls. Now they were standing in the ruins of their own childhoods. Friday, June 29th, 2018, marked the official end. Across the United States, the remaining 735 locations prepared to close their doors forever. There were no corporate executives present to offer a final farewell. The conclusion of the multi-billion-dollar empire was handled quietly by local store managers and tearful cashiers. As the final hours ticked down, employees gathered in the empty parking lots. They signed each other's uniform shirts like high school yearbooks. They shared stories, cried, and took final group photographs in front of the faded, sun-bleached signage. Inside the stores, a haunting visual organically emerged and quickly went viral across the internet. At one location, employees had arranged a human-sized costume of Geoffrey the giraffe, the ubiquitous, perpetually cheerful mascot, standing alone in a completely empty, cavernous aisle. In one hand, the mascot held a small suitcase. It was a stark, devastating image of corporate eviction. On the front glass doors of numerous locations, workers taped up final handwritten signs. One read, "Thanks for sharing your childhood with us." Another simply quoted the famous 1982 jingle, which now carried the weight of a tragic epitaph. "I don't want to grow up." At the end of the shift, the remaining employees walked out into the summer air. They pulled the heavy metal security gates shut. They turned the locks. And with a quiet final click, the physical entity of Toys R Us, the ultimate category killer, the undisputed king of the American toy industry, and a defining pillar of modern consumer culture, ceased to exist. In the months immediately following the summer of 2018, the physical footprint of the Toys R Us empire transformed into a nationwide gallery of retail ghosts. Across the American suburbs, 735 massive, custom-built retail warehouses sat completely empty. The architectural scars of the empire were impossible to ignore. On the facades of the buildings, the sun-bleached outlines of the massive rainbow letters, and that unmistakable backward R, remained clearly visible against the brick and stucco, lingering like shadows of a vanished civilization. By October, many of these cavernous spaces were temporarily occupied by Spirit Halloween pop-up stores, a grimly poetic metaphor for a brand that had essentially become a corpse. But in the ecosystem of modern corporate capitalism, a globally recognized brand never truly dies. It simply becomes a disembodied intellectual property. The physical stores were gone, the supply chain was dismantled, and the workforce was scattered. But the trademarks, the logo, and the likeness of Geoffrey the giraffe still held immense psychological value. They were legal assets, and like all assets in a bankruptcy, they were auctioned off to the highest bidder. Eventually, the rights to the Toys R Us name were acquired by WHP Global, a brand management firm that specializes in buying distressed retail trademarks. Their goal was not to rebuild the massive, capital-intensive superstores of the 1990s. Instead, they wanted to leverage the profound nostalgia of the millennial generation, the original Toys R Us kids who were now parents themselves. In 2021, WHP Global announced a highly publicized partnership with Macy's. The iconic toy retailer would return, operating as a shop-in-shop concept inside hundreds of Macy's department stores across the country. Press releases hailed it as a triumphant resurrection. However, for anyone who remembered the sheer scale and overwhelming sensory experience of the original category killer, the Macy's revival was a stark, almost depressing contrast. Instead of a sprawling 40,000 square foot wonderland with endless aisles and towering shelves, the new Toys R Us was often just a modest, curated footprint. It consisted of a few neatly arranged gondolas situated near the children's clothing department, watched over by a life-size cardboard cutout of Geoffrey the giraffe and a small bench for photo opportunities. It was a sanitized, miniaturized ghost of what the brand used to be. It was no longer an immersive destination. It was merely a nostalgic marketing gimmick designed to drive foot traffic into an aging department store. The soul of the company could not be resurrected on a few shelves. As the dust settled on the liquidation, the mainstream media narrative often summarized the fall of Toys R Us with a simple, convenient explanation. They were killed by Amazon and kids playing on iPads. But retail historians and financial analysts who studied the autopsy knew that this was a fundamental mischaracterization of what actually happened. Right up until the moment they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, Toys R Us was still generating over $11 billion in annual revenue. They still commanded a massive dedicated customer base. They still held significant leverage with toy manufacturers. They did not die of natural retail causes, nor were they simply abandoned by the American consumer. They were financially suffocated. The true cause of death was the $5.3 billion in debt strapped to their balance sheet during the 2005 leverage buyout. Wall Street investment firms had treated a beloved cultural institution as a mechanism for financial extraction. The private equity consortium drained the company of the capital it desperately needed to modernize its stores, pay its employees a competitive wage, and build a digital infrastructure capable of rivaling Amazon. They were sent into the most aggressive retail war in history wearing a $5 billion straitjacket. What the American public lost when those glass doors locked for the final time was far more than just a supply chain for plastic goods. They lost a dedicated physical space in the cultural landscape. Toys R Us was one of the very few commercial environments built entirely around the scale, perspective, and desires of a child. For decades, a trip to the toy store was a rite of passage, a reward for a good report card, and a pilgrimage of imagination. Children could wander the aisles, touch the boxes, and physically interact with the sheer scale of possibility. Today, the mechanics of buying toys have become highly efficient but undeniably sterile. The friction of the weekend shopping trip has been replaced by the frictionless algorithm. Parents buy toys with a single click on their smartphone while sitting in traffic, waiting for a brown cardboard box to arrive on their porch 2 days later. Or they grab a heavily discounted Lego set from a chaotic Target aisle right next to the laundry detergent and the paper towels. The transaction survived, but the magic did not. The ghost of Geoffrey the giraffe still lingers in the collective American memory, a reminder of an era when a massive building could be dedicated solely to the joy of play. The rise and catastrophic fall of Toys R Us stands as a profound, enduring lesson. Even the most beloved institutions, those that seemingly own a piece of our childhood, are never safe from the cold, invisible, and unforgiving mathematics of Wall Street. The story of Toys R Us is often oversimplified by modern pundits as a basic cautionary tale about the internet destroying traditional retail. It is convenient to blame iPads, video games, and Amazon's algorithms for the demise of the world's greatest toy store. But as we have seen, the truth is far more complex and far more tragic. An empire rarely collapses from a single misstep. The foundation of Toys R Us was initially fractured by early digital arrogance, embittered by the relentless, predatory price wars of big box competitors like Walmart and Target. However, what ultimately killed the category killer was not a sudden lack of children wanting to play. It was a Wall Street mechanism that prioritized short-term financial extraction over long-term corporate survival. The $5 billion anchor of the 2005 leverage buyout systematically stripped the company of the exact resources it desperately needed to adapt, upgrade its physical stores, and survive the retail apocalypse. When the final locations went dark in the summer of 2018, America lost more than just a massive inventory of action figures and board games. It lost a uniquely dedicated physical space, a sprawling, brightly colored sanctuary built entirely to celebrate the sheer scale of childhood imagination. This collapse reminds us that retail is never purely about the transaction of goods. At its absolute best, it is about the rituals, the community, and the deeply ingrained memories forged while walking down an aisle on a Saturday morning. The vanishing of Toys R Us serves as a stark, enduring warning. In the ruthless ecosystem of modern capitalism, nostalgia is not a business strategy. Past dominance offers absolutely no protection against the future. Even the most beloved, seemingly invincible institutions can be rapidly dismantled if they are treated merely as numbers on a balance sheet rather than living parts of a culture. What was your favorite memory of visiting Toys R Us? Was it pulling a paper ticket for a new video game? Or simply wandering those endless aisles looking for the perfect birthday present? Share your stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the rise and fall of an American retail giant, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another documentary. Thank you for watching, and remember, the stores may be gone, but the memories of being a Toys R Us kid will never truly grow up.